Good evening again. My name is Jason Green, and it is my pleasure to moderate our last panel this evening here with the Born Free generation. And quickly, my background, I co-own a company called SkillSmart, which focuses on matching skills and talent to employers and to educators here in the United States. I also am producing and directing a documentary around community, and am most recently the former associate counsel to President Obama. I had the great pleasure of being in South Africa in 2006, working with a NGO, the Kulamani Support Group, where I was there in a legal capacity, helping them think through their foreign investment strategy and developing a human rights compliance tool to increase foreign investment in the country of South Africa. So I was there to be captured by the South African spirit, and am very proud to be affiliated with SAWIP and on the advisory board here in Washington, D.C. And I've had an even greater pleasure of getting to know this year's class, the class of 2014 in particular, the students who are up on the panel right now. And I wish that there had been an opportunity for each of the members of the class of 2014 to be here, for you to experience them, their great talent, wisdom, experience, knowledge, and great passion for their country. But I assure you that the four students that sit before you are a great representation of each of those elements of the class of 2014. I'm sure that you have enjoyed being talked to and talked about, and now to have the opportunity to share some of your thoughts about South Africa. You know, this generation has lived the last 20 years and has great thoughts about how the next 20 years should go. And so I've asked them to think about the experiences, what are the issues that South Africa is going to have to address and have to face over the next 20 years, and think about their vision for what South Africa should, can, and will look like over that 20-year period. And so I'm going to ask them each to, I was originally going to introduce them, but you've already heard too much of my voice. And so I would like them to share just a few sentences about who they are, their background, because I really believe that is very hard to divorce from their vision of South Africa over the next 20 years. I know that we are already, before we begin, short on time. And so one of the things I was hoping to do was to engage in some dialogue between the students, because that is one of the best aspects of SAWIP, the exchange of ideas. We may not get to that, but I'm going to try very hard. And so I also ask you to keep your responses short on your vision of South Africa and your personal history, so that we can try and get to some of that exchange. And then, if the gods are smiling upon us, perhaps we can get to some questions from the audience as well. But Tatu, if you could begin, that would be tremendous.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'd love to say thank you very much for sacrificing a beautiful afternoon in Washington, D.C. to see a group of eager young South Africans. I think we have so much to learn from you as you do from us, so thank you for that. My name is Tato, and I'm a Bachelor of Business Science student from the University of Cape Town. And I've fallen head over heels in love with Washington, D.C., so it's a great place to be. I'm interning at the World Bank Group, and my interests, are we to discuss what? So I think my colleagues, my very learned colleagues here, are going to tackle some very, very heavy issues. And South Africa is a complex algorithm of issues. So I will focus on one in particular, and that is leadership. And for me, leadership encompasses two aspects: leadership from a macro perspective and leadership from a micro perspective. And I'll unpack these two perspectives shortly. From a macro perspective, I think leadership is one of the most fundamental factors in any institution, from business to government to NGOs to schools and even in families. The true definition of leadership involves being vision-oriented, service-oriented, and really focused on serving your constituencies. And I think that's something that's lacking in South Africa, particularly from a political standpoint. I think our leaders aren't championing the vision of South Africa and moving us forward. We did have a very, very innovative plan, National Development Plan, coming through from Cyril Ramaphosa, as well as Trevor Manuel, that really tried to walk us through our journey for the next few years until 2030. And that vision is a vision of a prosperous South Africa where equality is championed and education has improved. Unfortunately, though, those who are in power, from civil society to business and in government, aren't championing the national development plan as they should. And I believe that that causes a serious problem. And as previous speakers on panels have spoken about the lack of management in African leadership. So I think there's room for improvement there. On a more micro and a more granular scale, I think we as South Africans really need to get our hands dirty. I think we need active citizenship where we really take up arms on the ground and from a grassroots perspective and make change happen where we can. We cannot only just rely on business, nor can we only rely on government. We need to make it happen. And we've seen incredible examples of this happening in South Africa, one of which is Crimeline SA, which was championed and started by an ordinary South African citizen. And Crimeline SA deals with reporting crimes anonymously, so South Africans can report crimes anonymously on their cell phones. And that has resulted in a lot more criminals being captured and prosecuted. Another example is the HIV/AIDS grassroots movements that are happening at home. So you have a lot of partnering with clinics and hospitals and government programs, even PEPFAR, and they make, and they've worked really, really hard in making change happen from a grassroots level. And I think that also speaks to the African spirit of Ubuntu, which is Motuke Motukabat, which means that I am who I am because of others. And if we really take up arms and we connect as a community and partner together from a very grassroots level, I think there's room for change there. Thank you.
Lauren?
Sure. Thanks, Jason, for the slight introduction. My name is Lauren Hess. I'm a second-year political science, philosophy, and economics student at the University of Stellenbosch. And when we were first asked to kind of think about what mattered most to us, I had to explore a little bit deeper to see why I'm motivated about certain things. And one of my main passions is understanding the dynamics of inequality in South Africa, and there's a lot of data to work with. So when I was a kid and we started learning about apartheid, everyone was talking about Nelson Mandela, and he's this wonderful man, and look at what he's done for the country. And then we heard that he'd been arrested during this time. And when you're a kid, that seemed completely ludicrous. So I went home, and the centers of knowledge at that point are your parents. So I asked my mom, how could they put Mandela in jail? I mean, what did he do? Only bad guys go to jail, right? And when a kid asks you such a complex question, it can be very difficult to give a simple answer. But the answer that she gave me has kind of stayed with me till this day. And she said, the government put him in jail because he tried to make them share, and they didn't want to. And I think that's a problem that is still very rife within South African society. And while my colleagues will probably go into very much more specific examples, with Tato mentioning leadership, and I'm sure Velani will have a few words on business and how better to integrate those into South African economy, I think looking at inequalities in terms of structural inequalities, racial inequalities, and class inequalities have kind of made South Africa a place with so many opportunities, but only for a few. And I think, as Tato has said, lack of leadership has exacerbated these issues with now not only inequalities along racial lines, but increasingly between people of the same races, which alienates many South Africans from one another to such an extent that when you're asking people to help their fellow countrymen, it becomes a very them and us on all different kinds of society. And that's why I believe that if we really want to tackle this problem, it's a tough one, but a challenge that will be overcome. And that's why leadership in business, in grassroots levels, in government and civic society, we really need to take it back to recognizing each other as South Africans, and that's everyone. And it sounds a bit idealistic, but I believe it can be done, and there is a lot of great work going on in various NGOs. I work with the United Nations Association of South Africa in Stellenbosch, and something as simple as a reading project is not just about literacy, but it's telling children from Kayamandi, which is an impoverished, largely black community just outside of Stellenbosch, which is one of the places in South Africa that has the most millionaires per capita, that Stellenbosch can be a reality for them as well. So students coming into the community and not just talking about various comprehensions or things, but saying this is what we do at Stellenbosch, these are programs that are in place, and making things a reality and not just a far-off white institution that, they will never get to see. And I think programs like that, if those principles can be taken to much bigger scales, can do a lot of good to help our country in the next 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. Villani?
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Lauren. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Villani Mboweni. I'm from the University of Cape Town. I study a Bachelor of Commerce in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. I'm originally from Johannesburg, and I'm interning at the American Chemistry Council. When the question was posed to myself and the rest of the panel, I think it's very broad, it's very vast, and there are a number of fields that I could touch on, but I've narrowed it down to education, technology, and business. I think my vision for South Africa 20 years from now is increased education capacity and a population that is at least 30 to 40% middle class. President Zuma and the ANC have spoken about the second transition document, realizing the goals that the struggle veterans had fought for. I think my middle class would be more than just educated, but also have capital that is tangible. I think also with education, we'll do away with racially elitist institutes, particularly universities. Whilst you understand universities are inherently elitist, but there'd be racial elitism would be done away with. Furthermore, I'd like to expand on the corporate culture of South Africa, that the idea of startups, corporate South Africa is not completely risk-loving towards them, and I think that my future South Africa would have a lot of embracement towards startups, as we have seen in East Africa. And finally, we'd like to see that business is not a zero-sum game. It needs to be a win-win situation for the society. I know South Africa emphasizes corporate social responsibility. I think we need to see both the investors, the customer, and everyone in the whole ecosystem benefiting and moving forward. And not to politicize anything here, but I think when you consider the ecosystem of how we can achieve the goals that South Africa needs to achieve, I'll quote the ANC and say, together we can move South Africa forward. Thank you.
Not to be at all political. Perfect. Thank you, Villani. Kessler?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kessler. I study law at the University of the Western Cape, and I'm currently doing my internship on Capitol Hill with Congressman Donald Payne Jr. So to jump straight into it, my vision for South Africa is quite simple. It's one that's built on the foundational values of our Constitution. When our Constitution came into effect in 1996, it literally was the glue for our society. It binded our society, and it brought people from various sectors of our society together. We've seen amazing decisions through the decisions of our Constitutional Court that directly speak to access, socioeconomic rights, and civil liberties of people. And a brief example, a couple of examples I can point to, is, for example, the decision of our Constitutional Court in the case of Grootboom, that mandated that the government is to act responsibly when giving houses to people. And so it created responsibility on the state to provide housing to those on the outskirts of our society, the poor and the marginalized. Another example is the decision in the TAC case, which gave direct access to antiretrovirals and so on. And so I believe that our society must grow socially, it must grow economically, and that the courts play an important role in all of this. But a direct aspect related to that is the way government facilitates that kind of process and the kind of burdens that the courts put on governments. So, for example, I believe that South Africa has a deep institutional problem. Institutions of transparency and accountability are deeply problematic in our society. And I'll point to a brief and very recent example of this. So, for example, as everyone in this room probably does know, the scandal of Nklanda, President Jacob Zuma's homestead. When a report was released by our public protector on this issue, it was immediately branded by the ANC as a liberal or neoliberal document that seeks to entrench hostilities within our country. They called for the resignation of Thuli Madonsela, our public protector. Those are the kind of things that are deeply problematic in our society. The lack of accountability and the lack of transparency. Another very short example is the spy tape scandal. Still, until today, the decision not to prosecute President Jacob Zuma has been in contempt of court by not releasing the spy tapes to the opposition party in South Africa. These are deep problems, and my future, the future that I wish to see in South Africa, the country that I would like to live in, and the country that I would perhaps like to see my children live in, is a country that is built on the foundational values of a transparent, open, and democratic society that speaks to the values of inclusion, a narrowing of the gap between rich and poor within our country. That is essentially the values that I believe that our Constitution entrenches, and the values that we should aspire to within the next 20 years. Thanks.
There's no shortage of passion there, as I warned you. Obviously, it was a very broad question, and your responses were appropriately broad and well thought out. I think your point actually is the umbrella response to all of them, dealing from government accountability to business and corporate openness, and through that openness, arriving at the inequality that Lauren was talking about, and that is leadership. My question to the panel is, how does South Africa groom that sort of leadership in the institutions that you've identified to achieve the sorts of outcomes that you've talked about?
Was the
Okay,
question
I
me
can
or?
answer that question.
Oh, sorry.
One way to do that is to support SAWIP. Because I am a business student. No. But SAWIP, I believe SAWIP addresses both the macro perspective and the micro perspective. And how the program does this, and many like it, the macro perspective from leadership development. So we do a lot of leadership development, curriculum development. We have exposure and work experience. So we get a really good sense of what's happening at a macro level. We understand best practice leadership and best practice methods in the industries in which we're passionate. On a micro level, many of us are involved in community development. And as we return to South Africa, we have a big community service project that we need to implement as a team. And that speaks to being able to make a difference on the ground at a very basic, simple, but honest and authentic way.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, just to follow up on Tato's wonderful answer, for example, I have a lot of experience just in the United Nations Association, and I think in South Africa we have no shortage of NGOs, and a lot of the students who go through such programs come out completely different. And I think although we have a lot of institutions, we must recognize that leaders, as Tato's mentioned, can be found in all walks and all sectors of life. And so while we can all aspire to be the president of our country, as I'm sure there are definitely some future presidents in our team, recognizing that the impacts you make on the ground are sometimes a lot more deeper than what the president can do from his seat. So for example, if even one of my students makes their way to Stellenbosch in a kind of context where their parents would never even have seen the doors of such an institution, that would be amazing in my eyes. Thank you.
I think, excuse me, the issue of leadership is that I think there's no shortage of leaders in South Africa. I think the problem is that many people want the glory but are not prepared to walk the story. I think fundamentally there are people who really love the title of being a president or being an SRC member or being any top position, but very few of them are willing to get their hands dirty and roll up their sleeves. I think SAWIP is, it's great that we can come to DC, but at the end of this we have a big community service project to implement, and that needs to be sustainable. That we've come from really good institutions, university, we study well. We also had to put in a lot of time serving our community. We had 30 hours that we had to complete before we got here. We had to raise plus minus $700 prior to getting here. So there's a lot of service and action that we've been called to do. And I think that's one thing that that people need to realize about leadership, that it's not an end goal. Leadership is a journey. You have to keep walking it. You have to keep not only talking it, you have to keep walking and talking at the same time. And I think, as Lauren had mentioned, it's a grassroots issue. You have to get on the ground, because one problem is being detached. I think people get political legitimacy because they seem like they are one of our own, but sometimes people can be very detached from society. So I think leaders are no shortage in South Africa. It's just the quality of leadership that needs to be out there, and I think it's also connecting the leaders in society to different points and core. I think social movements like Nkulu Free Hate that had done a really big campaign called the Our Voice, Our Vote campaign, which mobilized a lot of leaders in different areas and different parts of the country, the various provinces. They mobilized resources to get the campaign rolling. And I think that there are people who are committed and convicted to making a big change. And the leaders, there's no shortage of them. It's just how the information gets out and how willing and prepared people are. Just like Mandela and the people of 1948 who joined the ANC Youth League, who were convicted by the cause and the freedom of their people.
Very good. Kessler, if you have any further thoughts on this point.
One thought, yeah.
Number one.
One thought that's only one point. So I agree with Villani that we do have lots of aspiring leaders in our society. I think the question is, what are the quality of leaders we have in our society? And I don't think that we fundamentally question the kind of leaders we produce in our society. At a school level, we don't focus on having accountable, transparent, people-driven leaders. We don't focus on that at university either. And so I think perhaps a focus and a perspective on people-centered servant leadership at both a school level and a university level could do wonders for the quality of leaders we produce.
Thank you. Did you have another thought? No? Just looking at the time here, I think we're going to be able to have about 5 minutes of audience questions. If folks have any questions, please raise your hand, and we've got some mics coming around. And if you don't have questions, I do. Please stand up, and we'll, as has been happening all day, I'll just receive all the questions and then sort of farm them out a little bit.
Oh, can you please hold this? Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Matapelo Lihuzo, and I'm team manager for SAWIP 2014. Now, my question is directed at you, Kessler. You spoke about, holding dear the principles of our constitution. And now I wanted to ask, the principles that you actually mentioned, accountability, openness, transparency, that are deeply entrenched in our constitution. Now, how do you suggest that, Section 9 institutions, actually like our public protector's office, actually, those principles in the constitution are well implemented? How do you suggest that, the policy is there, the principles are there? Now, how do we make sure that the implementation is actually, proper?
Great, thank you. Yep, right here. Could you wait for right here to your left?
Yes, hello. Could you say something about this wonderful community service project that several of you have alluded to? What is it, and what are your various responsibilities in that?
Great, thank you. Right here.
Hi, my name is Alice Jemfi. I'm the CAO of an organization, nonprofit called the Bright Foundation, and I'm particularly interested in hearing from you, Ms. Thata, on how you think women and their position in South Africa's business community and leadership community, and how they can truly have a stake in that. How do individuals who will never have the opportunity to come to the United States and study, to come to the United States and benefit from SAWIP as we have benefited, gain those type of leadership experiences? Individuals who are from South Africa and will never leave South Africa to grow and be mentored in that capacity, instead of individuals who are expected to come to the United States or come to other Western and developed nations and receive that knowledge and possibly go home and share it with no guarantee of going back to their home country. How do ordinary South Africans, ordinary Ghanaians, ordinary Nigerians gain that kind of empowerment and knowledge and leadership without ever leaving those countries? What do we have to do to get those kind of social institutions there? Thank you.
Women's empowerment. One more question if we have it. Just right to your right. That's gonna be our last one.
I respect all I've heard about.
Other way.
Oh, sorry, I've got to turn around. I respect all I heard about leadership, but I haven't heard about the people who you want to lead. And I'm curious to hear about the commonality that you would find as leaders that would serve the greatest number of people in good ways.
Tell me a little bit more on that question. The commonality of the.
the commonality of the people that you would like to lead. When you talk about leadership, it implies that there are people who are going to be led, hopefully in good ways. And my question is, in South Africa, is there commonality in the universes that you will be working in or living in that you will emphasize when you become a leader?
Got it. Thank you. So Kessler on the constitutional question. Lauren, maybe you could take the community service question. Villani, I'd like you to take that leadership question. And
We divided exactly that way.
is that the way it already was divided? And I'd also like, one thing we didn't talk about was sort of strategies on business leadership. And so if you could address that as well, and then if you could also address the question on women's empowerment, that'd be great. Maybe we can flow from you to Kessler.
Your turn. So
Oh, I'm
from
starting.
you to Kessler.
Right. Thank you for that question. I think it's such an important question, particularly in the developing world. The role of women, the women in business, women in the professional sector. I'm currently interning at the World Bank Group, and this is exactly the work we're focusing on. And studies, countless studies across the developing world and the developed world have found that having equitable representation of women in business is good for business and good for development. So it's not just a fuzzy topic, a women's issue, but having more women sitting at senior leadership and even as employees in a company consistently result in better performance for a company. So I think that is really important, and it's a space that has a lot of room to grow in South Africa, where our JSC only has approximately 12% of the CEOs being female. Secondly, the question around passing it forward. How do we make sure that everything that we've learned here and everything that we're experiencing is actually relevant and we can pass it forward to the people at home? And I think that goes to the concept, again, of Ubuntu, but importantly of paying it forward. I think it's our prerogative as 18 of us, all of us here, have the responsibility to go back, not just to our communities and in the community service project, but our friends, our family, our social circles, and even at our universities, to really spread this message, to work with our fellow young people in South Africa and encourage them to pursue their dreams, and also sharing the lessons we've learned here.
Sure. Hi there. Thank you for the question. And I think the most daunting part about this one is that the community project doesn't exist yet. Part of the process of SALP is that we as a team, all 18 of us, have to sit down and develop this idea. And with people working and having interest in leadership institutions, people thinking more along lines of educational support, maybe myself thinking along issues of identity, I know that it's going to be quite an intense meeting. So for now, our project is still up in the air, but I know that we'll be working in the wineland areas of the Western Cape, which are quite affected by issues of FAS and still the DOP system, which was where farm workers were paid in wine and then kind of addicted to the wine and kind of enslaved in a way. So those kind of inequalities and consequences are still very real. So I know whichever community and whichever project we do end up implementing will be very well received. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you to the gentleman in the crowd. I think my question is twofold. Interesting, I had prepared a great deal on business and technology, but hopefully we'll get there. The commonality of the people who want to be led, who are these people? I've been living in Bethesda, Maryland, and I've really been enjoying the society, the environment, and I realized that it's taken America about 200 years to get to where they are right now. Coming on the back of democracy in South Africa, we've only taken 20 years, and it's still a work in progress. South African society currently is on a needs basis. People are divided into class structure, as Karl Marx would have emphasized. And I think when I look at the working class, their needs are basically about service delivery. They want leadership that would, initiatives and leadership that will deliver basic housing, water, sanitation, education. When I look at the middle class, they look for economic opportunities. These are people who look to also withhold the Constitution and respect that. They also look for economic growth. And therefore, the crux for the middle class is the issue of apart from economic growth, is experiencing tangible change and having more access for what they can do in society, whether it being the ability to travel, whether it be the ability to sit in a room with various people of different backgrounds, because as you know, it was a racially divided society. So as the middle class grows, people want education. However, a common theme that has occurred in this panel before us was the issue of management. The leadership issue is one that is highly morally sensitive. So the people out here are about working class, middle class, and of course upper class, who have their very specific needs. Unfortunately, I'm not part of that upper class echelon, so I can't really speak about them. But then it then translates to my next point, which is on the strategies of business leadership. A very common phenomenon that has taken place in the dot-com bubble is the idea of startups. One of the challenges, interestingly enough, that we had before we got into SARB was to raise funds. Like I mentioned, about $700. People would send emails, people would have events. I took on the initiative of doing crowdfunding, where you go on the internet, you pose with a picture looking like Nelson Mandela, you can see the line, and you pretty much pitch to people why you need this money. The startups theory has two concepts. One is the inheritor, which is a partnership between this idea and the potential partner who would link up with you, and this would be a very conservative approach. And then you have the originator, which is one that is incredibly wild and groundbreaking, where there's no established standard in the market. So with regards to the strategies of business leadership, I think startups are a key thing because it sets a new status quo. It sets a new boundary. It sets a new barrier at which people can then engage moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I must begin answering my question with slightly disagreeing with Villani. I don't think the enforcement of our constitution is entirely a middle-class concern or exclusively a middle-class concern. If anything, we've seen it being a pro-poor concern. So yes, well, on this section, Chapter 9 institutions, for those who aren't familiar with Chapter 9 institutions, they're independent institutions created by our Constitution to safeguard our democracy. And so the question was, how do we ensure their independence? I think we should look to two things. First, we must have a government that isn't hesitant about the independence of these institutions. They must adamantly protect it, they must adamantly respect it, and they must adamantly encourage the independence of those institutions. We haven't seen that. The second thing is we should look to our courts to enforce the independence of those institutions. So when, for example, the resignation of Thuli Madonsela is called for, and if it happens to be acted upon, we should go to the courts as independent institutions that safeguard our democracy and protest for that kind of thing. The second thing is, and this is an example where we've seen our courts being useful in this regard, is on the issue of the National Director of Public Prosecutions, where we've seen the court say that the NDP has a duty to act in an accountable and fair and transparent manner, and that it shouldn't be dictated from the national government, and it shouldn't drop cases that are very important for our democracy at a whim of political interference. Thanks.
Thank you. Can we give a round of applause? Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and so aren't going to be able to get to all of the other points that I'm sure you guys are on the tips of your tongue and you want to address. I'm very proud of all that you guys just discussed, and very thankful for the time that I've had to spend with you all to talk through some of these issues. You heard some qualifications in some of the statements that were being made. We talked about big ideas, and then you would walk your ideas back to say that might sound a little pie in the sky, or that might sound a little Pollyanna-ish. And I encourage you to not qualify those statements, because what SAWUP is about, what you 18 students are about, are big ideas. And so when you go back to do your community service project as the first step, you're taking the first step of a big idea. And so I encourage you to continue to be the leaders that you talk about, to represent that, and to be the change that South Africa is asking for and calling for. I had the pleasure of working with Barack Obama on his 2008 presidential campaign, and one of the things he said quite a bit was, he would end his speeches saying, one voice can change a room, and one room can change a city, and one city can change a state, and one state can change a country, and one country, can change the world. And the people who would sit in that audience would look at him and think that he was talking about himself because he was the one talking. But in reality, he was talking about each of the individuals sitting in that audience. He was talking about you 18 young people and your ability to change the trajectory of your country as you see it. So I thank you for the time tonight. I think we can all give one more round of applause.
And a round of applause for Jason for a very nicely run panel. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to ask Karen to come up and say a word for SAWIP. And on behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Center, I thank you for all coming, staying with us for this duration of time. It's been a remarkable afternoon, and what a way to end it with these remarkable young people. Some of us will be seeing more of them this evening. And thank you again for coming and being a part of this great day. Karen?
Right now I'm standing seriously between us and some really good enjoyment. Not that this wasn't terrific, so thank you. It was. And just walking back from that, really I think this was a fantastic afternoon. I enjoyed every single panel. I thought the quality of the discussion was terrific. And so I want to just I'm very thankful as I'm standing here. I want to thank all our panelists, all our moderators, all the guests who were here. Thank you. Where are you? Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Wilson Center for allowing us to have this wonderful occasion. And everyone here again, everyone who came out, thank you so much. The questions you asked, your involvement, this was just terrific. And I think we're all now energized, and we all want to ask these guys and the others here a lot more questions, so I'm not going to stand much between you. Now, there is a little bit of a logistical issue here. There is a ticketed event just after here, and in fact, there's a registration that started sort of 5 minutes ago across the hall. So you may say, but I love this so much and I want to continue talking to these people and I don't have a ticket. So in that case, there are two options. The one is to actually come and talk to me if you want to join us. That would be terrific. And if you can't stay but you want to be more involved, please come and see me. And there's Johan. If you can just raise your hand, he's the chairman. And then we have Albert at the back too. So come and talk to us and see how you can become more involved with SAWIP. Because it's not only about us here in the room, it's also about the future of South Africa and Africa. And there are various ways that we can work with other partners too to make things happen, to make big things happen and to start on a journey. So thank you again and have a wonderful evening.